Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Timothy with Jank Diver Gaming and welcome to the new channel. If you're joining from the Discord or my other YouTube channel Mana Rocks, then welcome. This will be the new channel for Cube and Magic related content for the Jank Diver community, so spread the word and let's keep this community growing. For our first video on the channel, we're going to be looking at the Kaladesh Remastered update for the Peasant Cube. We'll have an update for the Unrestricted Cube as well, but for now, we'll be taking a peek at the Kaladesh Remastered set and going over all of the changes we'll be making to the cube with this new set. Last time, you all gave me feedback that you wanted to know which cards were leaving the cube, as well as changes that were made with the update that weren't necessarily related to the new set, so we'll be including that information in this video. Note that the cube size is increasing to 450 cards with this update, so there won't be a direct one-for-one swap for every card mentioned today. Since artifacts are the highlight of the set, we'll be kicking things off with our colorless section, but before we do that, remember to subscribe to the channel below for more cube updates like this, and if you're not part of our Discord community, join us using the link in the description below this video. Alright, let's take a look at our Kaladesh Remastered update for the Peasant Cube. It's no secret that the Peasant Cube's colorless section has a few filler cards floating around, but with Kaladesh Remastered, it feels like we'll finally be able to tighten up this section and cut the undesirable cards from the cube. Taking the spotlight are the vehicles of the set, which will bolster aggressive and mid-range decks and give them some heavy hitters. The star vehicle from the set is Untethered Express. It attacks as a 5/5 trampler and gets progressively bigger every time it attacks, and while it's just a fantastic card, it's nice that it has some inadvertent +1/+1 counter synergies with cards like Conclave Mentor and Iridescent Hornbeetle. I expect the train to deliver in aggro decks, but on top of that, vehicles come with their own set of quirks. They're essentially immune to sorcery speed interaction and can't often be targeted by ETB effects like Exclusion Mage or Ravenous Chupacabra. Aggro hasn't exactly been falling behind the other strategies, but it's nice to give those decks the resilience by including vehicles in the mix. Skyskiff is up next, and while it's not as flashy or memorable as the Pain Train, it holds its own, giving aggro decks a persistent beater in the air. 2 damage per turn in the air doesn't sound like much, but it lets the aggro decks keep chipping away for evasive damage once the ground gets locked up. The Skiff is a nice little crossover card between the Flyers decks and the aggro decks that are looking for a little bit of reach in their game plan. Skyskiff will be taking the place of Sky Scanner, a card which reads like it's fine but isn't really desirable for any deck. Even the Flyers decks that can best make use of Sky Scanner's body don't really want it, and the fact that it cantrips is overshadowed by creatures like Dusk Legion Zealot and Cloudkin Seer, which already have card advantage covered. Our next vehicle is a bit of an experiment. Bomat Bazaar Barge is a 4-mana 5/5 vehicle that draws a card when it enters the battlefield. The problem, it's Crew 3. Where the previous vehicles on this list have Crew 1 activations, making them active when virtually any creature is on the board, the Barge asks a little bit more of you to get it going. Thankfully, it at least cantrips for those instances where it's dead in the water. We wanted to remove Clockwork Servant from the cube, which has a lot of the same problems as Sky Scanner, and even asks that you develop your mana in a certain way in order to work. The Barge seemed like it could fill a similar role while giving the cube a tool for players to try out. It's the addition we're most skeptical of moving forward, but sometimes you have to experiment with things to see how they pan out. Our most expensive vehicle on the list will be Ballista Charger, a bulky 6/6 for 5 that pings any target for 1 damage when it attacks, and also has a Crew 3 activation. Again, Crew 3 is a whole different world than Crew 1, but I'm advocating for the Ballista to fill a specific niche for us. See, green decks tend to get walled pretty hard by some of the Death Touchers floating around, and the ability to ping on attacks can take out some of the key Death Touching blockers like Foulmire Knight or Mire Triton. On top of that, there are just enough 1 toughness creatures floating around that the ability to ping actually comes in quite handy, a lesson I've learned from Atzikin Archer, which has been quite good. It might turn out that the Ballista is a bit too slow and cumbersome to really make an impact, but I think green decks looking to remove small chump blockers and other roadblocks can make good use of it. And worst case scenario, the ping can just always hit your opponent. On top of that, Juggernaut has just been a bad card that's lingered in our colorless section for long enough, and we're relieved to get it off the list. Rounding out our vehicles is Oval Chase Dragster, a 6/1 with Trample, Haste, and Crew 1. Again, a cheap crew cost that really only asks that you have something on board to make it active. The reward is a huge beat into the opponent if they don't have anything to put in the way. Now, the 1 toughness makes this a little awkward since it trades with virtually anything, but sometimes you sneak a hit in with it when your opponent isn't expecting it, and 1 hit can swing a race in your favor, especially if the dragster lives to attack again. It's a nice little combo with Gear Shift Ace as well, which we'll talk about shortly, but on its own, it should be a good addition to any of the hyper-aggressive decks looking to turn sideways and get the opponent dead. Moving away from vehicles, we've got a couple generically good artifacts. Filigree Familiar is our honorary uncommon Solemn Simulacrum, a curve filler that fronts you a little bit of life gain and dies into a card later on. It's a point shy of the 3 life threshold that makes some of the build around black-white cards tick, things like Griffinary or Silver Smoke Ghoul, but it's not too hard to cobble together the last point of life gain. Fact of the matter is, Filigree Familiar is just a solid colorless card that most decks shouldn't be ashamed to play, and it happens to be a nice roadblock against aggressive decks, often trading off for a small creature or removal spell and fronting some life for your efforts. It's somewhat slightly above filler status since there aren't any archetypes that absolutely need a Filigree Familiar, but it can fill out the curve in just about any deck. And rounding out our artifact section are 2 cards worth talking about together: Renegade Map and Prophetic Prism. For the most part, these are just more mana fixing tools that we have at our disposal for the colorless section, which can help facilitate the 3 color decks that people occasionally find themselves drafting. Both Map and Prism are artifacts that can make their way into just about any deck to smooth out mana, and in some cases, it's probably fine to just trim a land for a Renegade Map. Prism's not easy to abuse, but it can trips on ETB, so a card like Rescuer Sphinx is happy to pick it up and replay it. We've reached critical mass of mana fixing artifacts to the point where we have to make some cuts, and we decided to put Chromatic Sphere on the chopping block. There's nothing wrong with it, but there's really not much of an incentive to draft it either, and it's one of our dorkiest cards in the list, so it's being removed. Kicking off our white section are 2 cards that we can talk about in tandem due to how similar they are. Those are the new white Fabricate creatures, Glint Sleeve Artisan and Visionary Augmentor. For those who have never played with Fabricate, you get a choice of having the creature come down with a certain number of +1/+1 counters, or you can create that many 1/1 servo tokens instead. Glint Sleeve Artisan is a 2/2 for 3 with Fabricate 1, while Visionary Augmentor is a 2/1 for 4, but with Fabricate 2. Due to the nature of Fabricate, it plays well in multiple white decks, letting you spread your damage out across multiple bodies, which plays well with mass pumps like Basri Solidarity or Pride of Conquerors, or taking advantage of the +1/+1 counters for something like a green-white deck. Neither of these additions will make or break the cube, but they will be solid inclusions to a number of different white decks, so they seemed like easy adds. Keeping in line with servos and token generation, our next card is Servo Exhibition. It's 1 and a white for a sorcery that creates 2 1/1 servo tokens. Pretty simple and not inherently super powerful, but as with our previous white cards, it plays well into white's themes. For the most part, this will play like a weaker secondary copy of Raise the Alarm, but white will take almost anything that can make multiple bodies. Cards like this make your mass board pumps better, and multiple bodies from one card can be very useful for some of the black-white decks looking to grind the game out with aristocrat effects. And while it's a small plus for the card, the tokens it creates are artifacts which can be beneficial for cards like All That Glitters. We want to emphasize that this isn't a powerhouse inclusion by any means, more along the lines of an additional copy of an effect that some white decks will be happy to take. Ronom Unicorn is getting the axe to make room for Servo Exhibition. It's a pretty miserable 2-drop for white decks that has some sideboard functionality, but it's a consistently late draft pick, and even when it does what it's intended to do, it doesn't feel like an exceptional trade-off. Next on the list is Kabira Takedown, a card we took a pass on when we initially made the Zendikar Ryzen update. We recognized that this card was reasonable, but decided we would take a second look at it when we got the chance. Well, we got the chance, and we think this card has some merit in the cube. The modal double-face cards have been mostly good to great, and the ones that offer decent creatures or situational removal on the front have been excellent. Kabira Takedown fits this bill, and seems like it should pull its weight. For one, it gives white decks a tool to destroy creatures without having to rely entirely on O-ring type effects like Banish and Light. It also seems like a great inclusion alongside the previous entry since it rewards you for having more creatures on board, making it a great fit for go-wide token decks. Lastly, aggro decks are happy to cheat on a land or two whenever possible, so giving them an MDFC that doubles as a removal spell seems like a good idea. Next up is Fairgrounds Warden, which is a welcome addition to the cube since it's our first iteration of this sort of ability that we have access to on Arena, at least at Peasant rarity. Nearly every color has access to a creature or two that can come down and remove an opponent's creature from the board. Blue has Exclusion Mage, black has Chupacabra, green has multiple fight creatures, and red comes close with things like Heartfire Immolator. White hasn't had a creature like that until now. White mostly has to rely on enchantment-based removal to get rid of threats, but having a card like Fairgrounds Warden gives it a small edge in a different direction. Sure, creatures tend to be easier to kill than enchantments, so your opponent is likely to get their creature back at some point throughout the game, but being a creature also comes with advantages. Creatures can be more easily recurred or reanimated than enchantments, so the Warden has potential to come back and take out a different creature even if it's answered the first time. This card will likely be sticking around until we get a better version of the same effect. Perhaps the most obvious white inclusion from Kaladesh is Aerial Responder. If your deck can support a card that costs 1 white, odds are you're happy playing the Responder. It's a nice crossover card for blue-white flyers and black-white life gain, but it seems like it should play out well in all white archetypes. A white-based aggro deck is obviously happy to pick it up, and this will be a great target to dump +1/+1 counters on in green-white. Funnily enough, Aerial Responder will be one of only 2 lifelink and flyers in the cube, the other being Healer's Hawk. There's a premium on the combination of lifelink and fly-in, and Vigilance being added in essentially for free is another bonus that just makes this a fantastic creature. Blessed Spirits is being handily dumpstered for the Responder. It's an underperformer, even in the enchantment-based sub-archetype it should be good in, and we're pretty happy to get rid of it. White gives us our first pilot in the cube, Gearshift Ace. It's a 2-1 for 1 in a white with First Strike, which is already a respectable card, but it also has some trinket text involving vehicles. If it crews a vehicle, the vehicle gains First Strike. While it's not exactly the strongest point of the card, it's a neat way of letting some of your vehicles bypass double blockers or death touch creatures. It's particularly deadly with the aforementioned Oval Chase Dragster. Usually the way to take care of that card is to throw 1/1 in front of it and just accept some damage. Well, not if it has First Strike. Gearshift Ace is fine on its own and has some neat little synergies floating around, plus we had another 2-drop we were fine getting rid of. Stonehaven Pilgrim seemed like it should be a decent player for white aggro decks, but it rarely comes together that this card gets to trigger its ability, and the enchantment sub-theme in white hasn't exactly panned out. So out with Stonehaven Pilgrim, in with Gearshift Ace. Shortly after the Core 2021 update to the cube, green-white counters was dominating our drafts, 3-0ing multiple weeks in a row. We decided to cut down on some of the counter interaction, which saw us trimming Tempered Veteran from the cube. It's back now, and we've got some extra room for it, and we expect it to be a good archetypal payoff for the counters deck. We've decided to cut Angel of Vitality, partly because we're glutted on white 3-drops, but also because the Angel has been fairly mediocre. Similarly to Blessed Spirits, it's a Windrake with upside, but the extra life gain isn't really a significant upside, and the times I've seen this be a 4/4 are few and far between. The life gain decks aren't hurting for payoffs or enablers, so we're basically swapping a life gain payoff for a +1/+1 counter payoff. Our final white edition is a bit of an oddball. It's Wispweaver Angel, a 4/4 flyer for 4 white that blinks another creature you control when it enters the battlefield. We don't have all the tools we'd like to make a full-on flicker deck for the cube, but Wispweaver is a card we're trying out to see if any real flicker combos come about. White has a few ETBs that are worth reusing, but the real power comes in crossing over to a different color where you can flicker your Exclusion Mages and Vampire Sovereigns and the like. It seems like a fun top-end white card, so we'll keep our eye on it. It's taken the place of Sir Allen, which isn't necessarily a bad card, but not exactly a super powerful one either. Decks will play Sir Allen, but nobody will miss him if he doesn't show up in a draft. The thing is, you can achieve the same kind of effect you're playing Sir Allen for with much cheaper cards, and you don't have to wait a turn to be able to attack with him for those cards to work. Again, he's not bad, but he's replaceable, and, well, we're replacing them. We'll start off a blue update with a new addition to our Flyers deck. As previously mentioned, blue-white as an archetype has suffered a bit as a result of the card pool we're working with, so a couple of the changes you'll see in the blue section are pointed at that issue. One of the glaring holes in the archetype is that we haven't had access to a premium 2-drop flyer in blue that the deck is really interested in. Skyship Plunderer is a great creature that fits exactly that criteria. We're already playing Kitesail Corsair as a concession to the Flyers deck, and Skyship Plunderer is a strictly better version of that. It's 1 in a blue for a 2/1 flyer that essentially proliferates a single target whenever it deals combat damage to a player. We moved a lot of the counter synergies out of blue, but in blue-white specifically, it's not that hard to get a counter on one of your flyers and use the Skyship Plunderer to grow that creature when it hits. It also happens to work nicely with Kasmina and Narset since it can pseudo-proliferate those two to get an extra activation out of them. This won't exactly push the archetype over the top on its own, but it's a nice addition. Moving up to 450 cards in the cube means that we have a little bit more room for redundancy, and we can include cards with similar effects to ensure that when you're drafting a certain deck, that effect is likely to get opened even when the whole cube isn't being drafted. The inclusion of Glimmer of Genius is a perfect example of this characteristic. We've got card draw covered with things like Chemister's Insight and Reign of Revelation, and we could quibble over which ones are better or worse, but adding Glimmer to the mix means that decks looking for draw 2s are going to be able to find them during the draft. Glimmer gives you a Scry 2 attached to your draw spell, which lets you dig a little deeper in the library for key answers or win cons. Unfortunately, the extra energy it provides isn't going to be super useful, but it's not why we're playing the card. If you're looking for a draw 2, Glimmer's an additional option that you can pick up along the way. Keeping in line with trying to buff the power of our Flyers decks, we've opted to add Curiosity to the cube. We've had a great deal of success with Curious Obsession, and we feel like it's one of the payoffs for being in a blue deck with evasive creatures, so we're testing an additional version of this effect to see if it bolsters the archetype in a meaningful way. Note that Curiosity draws you a card whenever the enchanted creature deals any damage, not just combat damage, so there are some niche situations where you can land this on a card like Gutter Snipe and draw off of its triggers. It's cute, but bear in mind this is definitely a plant for the flying deck and hopefully gives them a small edge. Maximize Altitude is biting the bullet for us here. Honestly, Maximize Altitude's never been a powerful card, but rather a corner case inclusion for decks that happen to have big dumb green creatures, while also being a jumpstart spell that can double trigger some of your spells matters cards. Even so, it's underdrafted and it's time for it to go. We'll go ahead and cover the next 3 additions as a whole group because they're all being added with the same focus on improving the density and consistency of blue Flyers decks. First is Stormfleet Aerialist, a 1/2 flyer for 2 mana that comes in with a +1/+1 counter if you've attacked with a creature the turn you play it. Second is Siren Reaver, a 3/2 flyer for 4 that costs 1 less to cast with its raid ability. And third, we're bringing back Aven Eternal, a Windrake variant that creates a 1/1 army token when it enters. These are all curve-out aggressive flyers that we feel might give the flyer decks a faster start when trying to beat down in the air. None of them do anything spectacular, but their purpose is to attack, and they do a pretty good job of that. Note that we freed up a spot for an additional flyer by cutting Calliphy from the cube. Calliphy has been exceptionally bad. Its protection ability is pretty poor. The fact that it's a beater for blue-based decks isn't something most blue decks care about, and it doesn't do anything to play into any of the cube's themes or archetypes. It's an easy cut, and we'll try out an additional flyer in its place. When we did our Zendikar Ryzen update, we decided to try out some of the modal double-faced cards we weren't sure about just because we weren't sure how to evaluate some of them. What we do know is that we settled on Jwari Disruption being pretty bad. When it counters something, it's fine, but the front side drops off quickly and the land half doesn't complement the front half very well. The double-faced cards are at their best when they provide situationally powerful abilities or work in the late game as a foil to the land side working well in the early game. Both sides of Jwari Disruption are only truly good in the early stages of the game, so it's played out poorly, especially by comparison to Censor. We're bringing in Quench to sub it out, which is also not a powerhouse counterspell, but has a little more longevity in a typical game than Disruption would. Quench will essentially serve as a placeholder counterspell until we get something else we're excited to try out. Speaking of previous updates, one of the biggest misses for us came with the release of KLD Remastered. We were excited to add Angler Drake to the cube as a top-end tempo or control finisher, but unfortunately, it wasn't included in the set. With this update, we're adding Roman Ghostlight as a sort of discount Angler Drake. Exclusion Mage is routinely one of Blue's best cards, so we went fishing for another similar tempo creature, and let's just say the options weren't great. That's not to say Roman Ghostlight isn't good. It's a 3-power flyer that sets your opponent behind. It's just not a premium version of this sort of effect. Ghostlight adds a small edge to fly-in and tempo decks at the same time, so we're going to give it a shot, and if another good tempo creature comes our way in the future, this will likely be the cut. Note that we're using Oneiriophage's spot for the Ghostlight. Oneiriophage is another underperformer that sometimes steals games by virtue of the fact that your opponent can't kill it before it gets too big, but it's too fragile the turn it comes down and dies a bit too easily. It was a fine run, but Oneiriophage is out and the Ghostlight is in. Our last blue swap is an exchange for Omen Speaker over Sigiled Starfish. Don't get me wrong, Starfish is a great creature to have in a long game, but the 0-3 body gets run over pretty hard if you're up against an aggro or beatdown deck. Omen Speaker provides more of its value up front, so it drops off a little later on, but Scry 2 later in the game isn't that bad either. What Omen Speaker does do well is jump in front of aggressive X1, so it can hold off a larger subset of attacks than the Starfish would. Again, Starfish is a limited all-star, but for the purposes of our cube, we think Omen Speaker is going to fill this role better. Trucking right along, we've got a pretty small update for our black section. The first addition from Kaladesh Remastered is Defiant Salvager, a 2/2 for 2 and a black that can sacrifice an artifact or creature at sorcery speed to get a +1/+1 counter. This is less of a threat itself, and more of a creature whose power lies in being a free sack outlet. Sure, it's sorcery speed only, so you can't blank removal spells with it, but this is what we're working with until a sack outlet like Nantuko Husk comes along. Sacrifice decks have been consistently good throughout the cube's iteration, so we're happy to see those decks pick up their first free sacrifice engine. Black has been our problem child from the start of the cube. We try to be careful not to overload black with too much top tier unconditional removal, and of all the colors, black has undergone the most adjustments to try and get its power level down to the realm of mortals. Our second black edition from Kaladesh Remastered is Essence Extraction, which fits in a nice place of being good but not too good. See, black removal usually falls into two categories. Early creature removal, like Disfigure or Moment of Craven, and more expensive unconditional removal, like Bake into a Pie or Price of Fame. Essence Extraction feels like a nice middle ground removal spell that can't kill the more expensive creatures, but deals with smaller to mid-sized creatures exceptionally well. Plus, the 3-point life gain is extremely relevant. Until the package of Griffin Eerie, Silver Smoke Ghoul, and Indulgent Patrician gets phased out, we'll continue to look for efficient ways to trigger the gain 3 life threshold without sacrificing power level. Note that we had some other removal spells from the new set to work with, notably Fatal Push and Vengeful Rebel, but we're tempering our black removal section. There may be room for them later on down the line, but we're treading lightly for the time being. Right in line with our train of good 3-drop black cards, we're adding Weaponcraft Enthusiast to the mix. It's an 0/1 for 2 and a black with Fabricate 2. Sure, you can play this as a 3-mana 2/3, but the power of this card is being 3 bodies in 1 for a pretty cheap cost. Black loves sacrificing creatures, and the more bodies you can get on board, the better. Not sure that there's much else we can say about this card, but we expect it to be a great addition to the Aristocrat-style decks that have been pulling their weight in this draft environment. Our next inclusion is the return of a card that actually just got removed with our previous update. Bond of Revival came out of the cube when we added Thwart the Grave, which is a card that's been difficult to evaluate but has ultimately been fun to play and powerful with the right kind of deck building. Now that we're moving up to 450 cards, we think there's room for an additional reanimation spell, so Bond of Revival's back in and ready to bring back some hasty Titanoth Rexes. The haste on Bond of Revival really does push it over the top of some of the other reanimation spells we have access to, as being able to swing with your big creature the turn it comes back helps mitigate the downside of that creature being bounced or killed before you get an attack in with it. Having this around improved the reanimation decks by a fairly wide margin, and it's a card we're happy to bring back. Our final change in black is a quick swap between Phyrexian Rager and Seeker Squire. These cards are comparable in a number of ways, but we feel like Phyrexian Rager's purpose is already covered with Dusk Legion Zealot, and the new additions to black from Kaladesh Remastered gave us a glut of 3-drops in black, so we shifted Rager's spot in the cube down to a similar effect in the 2-drop spot. Seeker Squire is a nice bridge card that can fit in any black deck, and even has a nice synergistic feel with reanimation decks by being able to bin a reanimation target when it's revealed off the Explorer trigger. This change won't have a huge effect on the environment as a whole, it was more of a shift in effects across different mana costs. Kaladesh Remastered doesn't have much to offer in the form of good red cards for Peasant Cube, so we're only adding a few red cards from the new set, and then we've got some other changes to address. Our first new card is Aether Chaser, a 2/1 first striker for 2 that creates a 1/1 servo the first time it attacks. Technically, there will be 1 or 2 other ways to generate some energy floating around the cube, but we're not supporting an energy deck in any real capacity, so don't expect to ever make more than 1 token with its ability. Even so, a 2/1 first striker for 2 that comes with an extra body on attacks is solid, and Aether Chaser should slot into most aggressive red decks quite nicely. Scrapper Champion is the other creature making its way in from the set. It's a 2/2 double striker for 3 in a red that lets you use 2 energy to put a +1/+1 counter on it when it attacks. Just like Aether Chaser, you should expect to get at most 1 trigger from this in any given game, which means Scrapper Champion is essentially a below the bar blocker that becomes a 3/3 double striker the first time it gets to attack. Interestingly, this is our first double striker in the cube, which comes with its own set of cool and interesting interactions. Double strikers pick up combat tricks and mass board pumps very well, so Scrapper Champion raises the stock of cards like Rimrock Knight and Bolthound, among others. Don't overestimate the card, it's still a somewhat poor blocker that needs to attack to reach its real potential, but when it goes unopposed, it's a huge threat that can end the game very quickly. Speaking of combat tricks, we're bringing in Invigorated Rampage, a pump spell for 1 in a red, which gives you 2 options. Either give 2 target creatures +2/+0 and trample, or give a single target creature +4/+0 and trample. Besides being a great combat trick to bring in alongside Scrapper Champion, it's a good way to just push through for a ton of damage. Even through blockers, Invigorated Rampage can account for a bunch of extra trample damage, and on an unblocked creature, this is 4 extra damage for 2 mana. The cube is certainly short on combat tricks, so you can even get bonus points by blowing someone out when they're not playing around it. It's a good addition to be aware of with this update, and we expect it to be a good role player for all-in aggro decks as well as the Gruul Stompy decks. The next 2 changes are me and Chris dialing back on something we were testing out with Zendikar Rising Update. Turns out the landfall creatures are mostly just bad, and we're eliminating all of them from green and red sections. That means Aquam Hellhound and Skyclave Geopede are coming out, despite not really being around for that long. Here's the problem with these creatures. There's a deck that theoretically exists by drafting all of the landfall creatures and ways to get extra lands into play, but it's almost never correct to take one of these creatures in the draft because you can't guarantee that you'll get the whole package, or that the other landfall creatures will even be opened in the draft. So once you've passed on one, you continue to pass them, and the deck never comes together. Skyclave Geopede can hold its own on attacks, but these creatures are largely terrible creatures on blocks, and they've all been more or less disappointing. To replace them, we're bringing in Scorch Spitter and Fireblade Charger. These aren't exactly all-star creatures either, but we wanted to up the density of 1-drops in red, and both creatures have some micro synergies with different cards in the cube, things like Chandra's Spitfire for Scorch Spitter, or the new Invigorated Rampage for the Charger. Ultimately, this change comes down to us just being displeased with the landfall creatures and trying out something else instead. Similarly to the previous change, we're cutting Song Mad Treachery from the cube. After much debate, I was convinced that this was worth playing over our other threat and effect in the cube, and after having played with it, I'm confident that Song Mad Treachery is mediocre at best. The idea was that the modal nature of Treachery would allow a wider number of red decks to play the threat and effect, but the only deck that really cares about this effect is red-black, which doesn't typically want to pay 5 mana for the effect. We're bringing back Traitorous Greed, which I'm positive is the best version of this effect that we have access to. It's more expensive than Claim the Firstborn, but it takes anything with no mana restrictions and refunds you 2 of the mana you spent on it, which is usually enough to activate an ability to sacrifice whatever you stole, or just cast another spell that turn. It has a small downside that you can't use the refunded mana and attack with the stolen creature, but I think that's a minor gripe. Songmat has just been bad, and it's taught me that the modal double-faced cards are not all just inherently good. They still need to be worth casting on the front side to really make the cut. Not long ago, we swapped Electrostatic Field out for Firebrand Archer, which both have the same ability attached to very different bodies. The idea behind the change was that Archer can attack and push in extra damage, while the Field is purely defensive and doesn't contribute much outside of its ability. Firebrand Archer has been fine, but just that, and we're making the swap back because Chris and I wholeheartedly believe that Electrostatic Field does its job better, even in decks that are looking to be aggressive. The biggest difference is the Field is exceptional in the spell-based control decks, whereas the Archer is never really exceptional, but only ever good at best in certain situations. We'd rather take the card that's always good in its intended archetypes and fantastic in some of them than the Archer, which peaks as a card that's just fine when it's doing what it's supposed to do. Our final addition to Red is Abrade, which was a card that we took a pass on when it became available to us with Amonkhet Remastered. At the time, we didn't really need another 2-mana deal 3 in Red, and while we still technically don't need that effect, it has some bonus text of being able to destroy an artifact, which was something we were interested in given the upgrades to our colorless section. Abrade's a great card, and it has some extra functionality as a shatter effect, which is a nice foil to our buffed up section of artifacts, so it should be a good role player here. Starting off our green update is Blossoming Defense, which is actually a strict upgrade to Ranger's Guile. Ranger's Guile was originally brought into the cube as a countermeasure for green to be able to deal with some of the more efficient removal floating around, especially the unconditional removal from black. It always sucked to ramp into your 6 or 7 mana creature and have it answered by a murder. Because of this, Ranger's Guile gets treated as more of a sideboard card and functions similarly to a counterspell against removal spells. The +1/+1 is marginal at best, and is not much of a factor in why you would play this card or sideboard it in. Blossoming Defense gives +2/+2, which is a much more reliable pump to get creatures through in combat while still giving you a response to a timely removal spell. We don't have too many combat tricks floating around, as we mentioned before, so they tend to catch people off guard when they're played, and Blossoming Defense gets to play double duty as a protection spell and a pump spell all in one. A strategic note about Blossoming Defense while we're here: if your opponent is attacking you with a creature while you have a removal spell, if you suspect they have a Blossoming Defense in hand to save their creature, it's often correct to let the creature hit you, then cast your removal spell post-combat. At least that way, if they do have the Blossoming Defense, you don't get blown out and take an additional 2 damage from the combat. With Kaladesh Remastered, we expect our green section to get a decent amount better, and part of that is due to the quality of some of the 5-drops we'll have access to. One such 5-drop is Arborback Stomper, a burly 5/4 trampler that gives you 5 life when it enters the battlefield. This is basically our uncommon Thragtusk, and it's a fantastic stabilizing card for the green decks when facing down a fast start from an aggro deck. Green decks seem to play out at their best when they focus on the 4 and 5 mana creatures as their primary targets to ramp into, and the 5 life from the Stomper is a great way to recover from a quick start on the opponent's side. It's pretty straightforward, and Arborback Stomper was one of our shoe-in 5-drops from this set. Our other big hitter in the 5-drop creature slot is Ridgescale Tusker, and man, this one is a house. As a 5-mana 5/5 that puts a counter on all of your other creatures, this was the best uncommon of Aether Revolt by a pretty wide margin, and I can't imagine it's that different for our cube. Clearly, this is a plant for the green-white +1/+1 counter deck, but it has the potential to put so much power on board that most green decks will be happy to pick it up, so don't expect it to do much wheeling. There was a lot of contention as to which 5-drop green creature to cut to make room for the Tusker, but we ultimately landed on Snapping Sailback. There's nothing wrong with the Sailback, it's just a solid standalone card, but until we have the tools to truly support some sort of flash deck, it's not a necessity in our list. Green is picking up one of the Fabricate creatures with Pima Outrider, a 3/3 Trampler for 4 with Fabricate 1. Data has shown that a 4/4 Trampler for 4 is something that Green is always interested in, and Pima Outrider bridges the gap between being a generically good creature as well as a playable for the green-white counters deck, as is the case with all Fabricate creatures. I like that there's tension with this card between making it a 4-power creature for some of your big creature payoffs like Garruk's Uprising, or splitting it up into 2 creatures to take advantage of some board pump like Overcome. This just means that more decks will be happy to pick up Pima Outrider, and if we're being honest, we could want to play with as many of the good Fabricate creatures as we can. In the same vein, we've got a switch for the cube that we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about. Fierce Witchstalker is back in since it's a respectable beater at 4, and proved to be a solid creature last time it was here. Canopy Baloth is out, and while the Baloth is one of the few landfall creatures that can hold its own, it's just rarely better than any of the other 4-drop green creatures with upside. For what it's worth, there's a world of difference between a 4/3 and a 4/4 as far as this cube is designed, due to the high density of 3 damage removal spells in red, so the Baloth often dies at a net tempo loss for the green player. It's been fine at best, if not just wholly unimpressive, so the Witchstalker is back to take its place. 2 more green creatures to talk about here, the first of which is Servant of the Conduit. It's a mana dork that comes with 2 energy and requires an energy to tap for any color of mana. We're not concerned about running out of energy since the Servant will rarely need to tap for mana more than twice to serve its purpose, and it's a 2/2 for 2, which is a fine body to have on a mana dork. Moving up to 450 cards means we've got some extra wiggle room for an additional mana dork, so from this point moving forward, we'll be looking to improve the quality of our mana ramp creatures whenever we're offered one. For now, Servant feels like it should be a good addition to Green's mana ramp suite, even if some of its original energy synergies are lost in this environment. Next up is Maulfist Revolutionary, which is a great addition to the +1 counters based decks. It's a 3/3 for 3, which is a tried and true set of stats, and when it enters the battlefield or dies, you get to choose a permanent or player and essentially proliferate any counters on it. 9 times out of 10, this will just add some additional +1/+1 counters to your creatures, but it's not limited to just +1/+1 counters, so it can squeeze out a few energy counters for anything that cares about it, or even add some extra counters to a Planeswalker or Saga you might have laying around. It's not a crucial creature to pick up for the counter-based decks, but it's certainly good, and sometimes puts your opponent in a position where killing it might buff one of your other creatures, so there's some tension with its death trigger. We nixed Excavation Mole, which by all means should be a fine creature at a 3/3 with Trample for 3 and some upside, but it's one of the least drafted cards in the cube, and the archetype it's intended for doesn't come together too often, and when it does, it doesn't tend to prioritize Excavation Mole because self-mill cards are simply stronger in black than they are in green. Green is pretty much last place when it comes to interaction and removal. We have access to some fight spells, and the creatures that fight on ETB are pretty good, but there's nothing quite as annoying for a green deck as facing down a couple small death touchers and knowing that you don't have many ways to clear them off the board. Monstrous Onslaught is a new weapon in our green toolbox that might help fill part of this hole. For 3 green, this sorcery takes your highest power creature, then deals that much damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures. There will be some situations where this is literally uncastable because you have no creature on board, but green is more than capable of sticking at least a 4/4, if not something bigger. At 4/4 being your biggest creature, this is already a pyrotechnics for your opponent's board, and it scales with even bigger creatures. It's our first green card for the cube that can take out multiple threats at once, similar to black and red mini sweepers. Even better, this card specifies that it counts the power of the creature as you cast Monstrous Onslaught, so if your biggest creature gets removed from the battlefield in response, you still get to divvy up the damage, so it can't be ganked like a traditional removal spell. Our multicolor section is one of the defining features of our Peasant Cube, and the move up to 450 cards means we'll be adding an additional card to each gold section to ensure payoffs are showing up even when the whole cube isn't being opened. The Orzhov section is one of the tightest sections we've got, and Hidden Stockpile feels like a welcome addition here. It's black-white for an enchantment that lets you pay a mana to sacrifice a creature and scry 1. Additionally, it has Revolt, which will create a 1/1 servo on your end step if you had a permanent leave the battlefield that turn. By itself, it's a bit of a self-contained engine, recycling the same servo over and over to dig through your deck. Alongside a Blood Artist type ability, it turns that engine into damage and life gain, and can even combine well with permanents like Evolving Wilds or Fabled Passage to just build a board of 1/1s. We knew we wanted this card before Kaladesh Remastered was even announced, so we're thrilled to pick it up. Azorius will be picking up Spire Patrol, a Frostlings type creature with decent stats for a flyer. I think by now I've beaten the point that we're restructuring blue-white flyers to death, so we'll make this brief. Spire Patrol is a great tempo card that keeps you ahead in the air while temporarily locking down a threat on the ground, so it can swing a race pretty handily. Azorius will also see Elite Guard Mage making a return to the cube in place of Arcanist Owl. The Owl was a recent addition that we wanted to test out, and it's been fairly medium overall. We're not going out of our way to support the Artifact Enchantment sub-theme in blue-white at the moment, so cutting the Owl felt right, and that left us with a toss-up between Elite Guard Mage and Cloud Blazer. An argument could be made for either one, and while Cloud Blazer has more explosive draw power, Elite Guard Mage is more reliable at stabilizing and does so a turn earlier, so we felt like it'd be the better of the two to include for now. Maybe we'll see Cloud Blazer later on down the line if the environment slows down a little bit, but it's out with the Owl and in with the Guard Mage at the moment. Dimir will pick up Discovery Dispersal as its 5th gold card, which has a flexible front side for any blue or black deck that might care about surveilling cards to the graveyard, but also provides a nice late game removal spell for your opponent's most expensive permanent. Dimir has been our top contender for a little while, so we wanted to give them something solid without providing anything too splashy or powerful. Neither half of Discovery Dispersal is that powerful, so it felt like a good fit. We've added more than half of Ravnica Block's CCDD cycle at this point, and we're going to expand that even further with the addition of Rakdos Firewheeler to the red-black section. We're a little weary of this since red-black as a color combination is already full of efficient removal, but we feel like the restrictive casting cost means you have to commit to have this as a reward, and you might have to make some concessions in deck building to be able to play it. Red-black decks often end up heavy in one color, essentially splash in the other, and that will make it harder to cast the Firewheeler, but if you do, it's an incredible creature. This whole cycle has just been amazing, so we're happy to find room for another one. Gruul's pretty one-note in what it can do in this cube, so we didn't have too much to consider when adding a new card to the mix. We settled on Domri's Ambush as a powerful Rabid Bite variant that can help a red-green deck press an advantage or clear a problematic blocker out of the way. Nothing too flashy, but a good card nonetheless. We also decided that since we're axing the entirety of the green-red landfall mini archetype from the previous update, that Brushfire Elemental should go. Voltaic Brawler will take its place and will likely be taking huge chunks out of the opponent's life total. Don't get me wrong, a turn 2 Brushfire Elemental can deal some damage, but it's a bad top deck, a bad blocker, and doesn't tie into the red-green themes very well, so it falls flat a decent amount of the time. Voltaic Brawler on turn 2 often deals even more damage, and is one of the few cards that can take advantage of a spare energy counter or the occasional proliferate to get an additional big hit in. We've been fairly happy with returning some of the +1/+1 payoffs to Selesnya after we cut back on them pretty hard a few updates back. We'll be adding Huatli's Raptor to this section, which gives us another proliferate creature in the cube and another obvious build around for green-white. It stands on its own just fine, and as with the green-white counters archetype as a whole, it can lead to some incredibly fast starts. Golgari picks up fan favorite Slimefoot, which we deemed a bit too slow a few iterations ago. With the extra slot open in each gold section, we feel like it's a good time to bring old Slimefoot back for a second run. He's a great mana sink, which we don't have much of, and he's actually got some extra support with Saproling Migration and Spore Swarm. There are plenty of other options in Golgari, so if Slimefoot ends up not working out, we've got replacements lined up, but try him out and show us if he's a good fit for the cube at this point. For Simic, we finally decided to bring in River Hoopy, so everyone can leave me alone about it now. Yes, it's always been a fine card, but I've always felt like it's overshadowed by Spectral Sailor being a monocolored card and having a cheaper activation. Going up to 450 cards means there's room for multiple cards that can sink mana into drawing cards, and River Hoopy might give blue-green an extra edge since it tends to play out like a big mana deck and doesn't have a ton of ways to use all of its mana turn to turn. Spectral Sailor is playable in every blue deck, so it gets drafted early. Maybe the Hoopy will prove to be an archetype-specific version of that card that won't get poached by other drafters if you're the one drafting blue-green. Is It was another section that had a handful of cards that could have filled the 5th slot, but we decided to keep it simple and include Goblin Electromancer, which is an archetype-defining card that always makes the cut in blue-red decks. Is It is one of the color pairs that plays in two very distinctly different ways, with one version of Is It being a hard control deck with Spells Matters payoff, and the other being a tempo deck looking to beat down and burn the opponent out quickly while fiddling with their board. Goblin Electromancer is a card that can go in either iteration of Is It, and isn't worth splashing in other decks, so it's easy to wheel in the instances where you're the only Is It drafter at the table. Boros continues to play out as a go-wide aggro deck, so it made sense to find another go-wide payoff. We've opted for Honored Cropped Captain, which has the stats to rumble on its own as a 3-2, and turns the rest of your attackers into real threats as well. There are quite a few versions of this effect now between this, Goblin Oriflame, Bolthound, etc., so Boros aggro should have an easy time finding this effect when it wants it. And to round things out, we've added Ether Hub, which is basically a one-shot mana fixer in the land slot. We had a space open for an additional land, and we didn't gain much in terms of utility land, so Ether Hub gets that spot. Note that we've also restructured the mana fixing lands for each color pair. We won't go over every single land, but just know that the types of dual lands you'll see for each section are no longer congruous throughout the cube. For example, we identified that red-white always plays out as an aggro deck, so we cut the Scry land in favor of a dual land that will support an aggro archetype better, and with the new 4th land slot, we gave Boros the red-white pathway. On the other hand, something like blue-black is almost always a dedicated control deck, so we kept the Scry land around and added the Cyclone Desert from Amonkhet. The overall effect of this mana base overhaul is that you should still see your fair share of mana fixing lands in a 450 card cube environment, and the lands you should see complement the strategy of that archetype. The pathways in particular are actually worse at splashing a third color than most other dual lands, but they complement their intended color pairs better, so we'll see how the change goes and adjust things as needed. Okay, that's it. This is a colossal update between the additional 45 cards coming in and all of the changes that we've gone over. I'm going to keep the outro brief because I've been talking for a while now, so let's know in the comments below how you feel about any of these updates. If you feel like something from Kaladesh Remastered is missing or being overlooked, or even something from an older set, let us know. Or hop over to the Discord and we can talk about it there. Remember, you can find a link to our Discord server in the description below, and subscribe to this channel for more updates like this. The Unrestricted Cube update should be significantly quicker, so I'll see you for that one later on. Thanks for joining me. My name's Timothy with Jank Diver Gaming, and I will see you all next time.